For Random Thoughts Episode 9, we're starting on the Bessemer and Lake Erie route in TS Classic, with cutaways to real-life or TSW6 footage when appropriate. I initially decided not to drive a steam locomotive this time, and went with a diesel locomotive from the New York, New Haven and Hartford Railroad instead. More specifically, this is an Alco S2, and for reference, she comes with the Springfield line add-on. I thought I would give an American diesel the spotlight this time, as a change from the British locomotives that I normally drive. I'm running on the B&LE route because A, I don't have many old-timey standard gauge US routes in my collection, and B, I'm more familiar with B&LE than the Springfield line. In the end, I decided to run the Alco S2 from North Bessemer to Renfrew, before swapping over to the Midland line and driving the New Zealand Railways P-Class 280 from Cass to Arthurs Pass. I was a bit disappointed upon realising that the S2 doesn't have the best sound set. I'll start with a discussion about KiwiRail's DM locomotives. From a railfan's perspective, of course, since I've never had a look in a DM's cab, let alone driven one of these things. For context, these locomotives are being built in Spain by the Swiss company Stadler, and 7 are currently in the country, with a total of 66 on order. Don't quote me on this, but apparently, the North Island is going to get at least 19 DMs as well, so eventually, we'll get to a point where us lot up north won't need to spend hundreds to get down south if we want to see them. As for what I think of the DMs overall, well, for one thing, the horn doesn't have as much oomph as the older Leslie RS2M, or whatever they've got on the older locomotives. While the prime mover sound is similarly lacking in oomph, and it reminds me of the UK's Class 68, because it's the same as what the 68 uses. Of course, at present, the DMs don't really have as much character as the older DX locomotives they're replacing. As for their appearance, it's certainly very different from the older DC, DFB and DX locomotives, and I can understand if people think the DMs are ugly as sin, but personally, I don't have much of an opinion on their appearance at the moment. Maybe that's just because I could be blinded by excitement over them being brand new locomotives. I'm not sure. In any case, it's interesting seeing products of Stadler running in New Zealand, and considering the manufacturer's good reputation, here's hoping that the DMs give reliable service for many years to come, although it will be a sad day when the last of the DXs bow out of service. Last night I had the strangest dream. But in this case, I didn't sail away to China in a little rowboat to find you. Instead, I was standing by the side of a road when along came a bus with a dirty great big advertisement on the side promoting Toni Basil, complete with a photograph of her in the famous, but in my opinion bizarre, cheerleader outfit that she wore in the Mickey music video. Speaking of Toni Basil, Do You Want to Dance is goated, and I am reminded of the video on parasocial relationships that I made last year, not to mention the other 2 people I discussed in that video. Even though I still watch Sydney Watson and Brett Cooper's videos from time to time, I have never agreed with every single thing those two have said. That would be a borderline unhealthy mindset. Come to think of it, I haven't been watching Brett's videos as often as I used to, largely because she often talks about topics that I consider frustrating, or outright bizarre, to the point where I don't want them ruining my day. But I will be fair to Brett by giving her credit for having more patience to deal with those sorts of things than I would ever have. However, there is one aspect of her videos that I dislike, and wish to see improved. That being how fast she talks, and how the editor often cuts out her pauses between sentences, with the end result coming across as a constant barrage of noise for 20-odd minutes. There was one occasion on which Dad and I were watching one of Brett's videos together, when suddenly he goes, "Take a fucking breath, woman!" And yes, those were his exact words. In any case, and as admittedly ridiculous as this sounds, part of me is still holding out a tiny amount of hope for meeting either Brett, Sydney, or Tony someday. Either that, or hoping that any one of the three could miraculously stumble across at least one of the videos I made about them. In the meantime, I am reminded of something that Toni Basil herself said in a recent interview with Taboo from the Black Eyed Peas. Does anyone remember that band? In which she said something about how you have to keep planting the seed, and it will eventually grow. That's a good way to go about things, if you ask me, and I'm not saying that just because Tony said it. Although I've started using it as a driving force behind some of the things I do, I wasn't aware of Tony's metaphorical seed planting idea for the longest time, so it wasn't really a driving force behind my decision to review TS Classic content, and keep going in that field, although I suppose I could say that, in the TS Classic and TSW scenes at least, seeds eventually grew anyway, despite me not specifically intending to plant them. I may only be 25 years old, but even then, I think I've had enough life experience to learn that the really good things often happen out of nowhere when you least expect them. Case in point, the connections that I've made with the Goldfields Railway in Wei He. Another example that randomly came to mind is the time when I was able to see this Class 57 diesel locomotive on a light engine test run at Newton Abbot. And of course, I can't forget Chris Wilson's unexpected act of generosity with Caledonia Works add-ons last year. I remember sitting at Rukuhia on that day and finding it hard to believe that it actually happened. Of course, I am still grateful for what Chris did for me. And now for some random questions that have absolutely nothing to do with each other, but they fit the video's theme of random thoughts. Why does the steam locomotive JB1236 have a green boiler, when NZR steamers traditionally have black boilers? What is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow? Who seriously thought converting an F45 diesel locomotive into a fucking lodge was a good idea? When will that blasted City Rail link in Auckland finally open? Who stole the biscuit from the biscuit tin? Why did Guns N' Roses think it was a good idea to cover Bob Dylan's Knockin' on Heaven's Door? Will we ever see Australian or New Zealand routes in Train Sim World? Who's Joe? And lastly, what is a question? A few years back, I was in a situation where I had discovered 3 similar-sounding British New Wave songs, and would go on to remember them well, but for the longest time, I never knew what their names were. I have since found out the names of all 3 songs. They were Skin Deep from The Stranglers, Steppin' Out from Joe Jackson, and Cars from Gary Newman. That last one is probably my favourite of the 3. Cars is a very strange song. but I mean that in a good way. While it's a fairly standard length, at 3 minutes and 45 seconds, the vast majority of the song is instrumental, so it feels like it goes on longer than it actually does. Come to think of it, you could say the same about David Bowie's Sound and Vision. In any case, the instrumentation on Cars has a very haunting sound to it, and I consider the song quite impressive for something released as far back as 1979. Aside from the song's iconic bass riff, another aspect of the instrumentation that stuck out in my mind was the high synth note that's held for 7 seconds, right after the drums kick in at the start of the song. I swear I remember that Gary Newman once said, in an interview with the Professor of Rock, that the long, high note was a result of him pressing the key on a synthesizer, I think it was a Minimoog, and sort of trailing off in thought without realising that he was still pressing the key, but that ended up being kept in the final mix of the song anyway. So, in other words, that long, high synth note was apparently a happy accident. As for what few lyrics there are in the song, they're notable for being sung to the exact same melody as the bass riff, and are apparently about nothing more than feeling safe inside a car, although some say that's actually a metaphor for wanting to be isolated. In any case, I highly recommend checking out Gary Newman's Cars if you like late 70s or early 80s new wave music. And now for an attempt to recreate the song's bass riff on the Class 710's horn. To close out the video, I would like to tell a story about a recent experience at a new hairdresser joint. For context, it was at a shopping centre in my semi-local area, although I'm not going to say which shopping centre it was. There was a different salon at the same centre that I had been going to for the better part of a year, but more recently, I was getting burned by really long wait times, sometimes as much as 100 minutes, every time I tried checking in for a haircut at that particular establishment. That seemed to be the case whichever day of the week I went, but I found that going there on a Tuesday in particular isn't a good idea, since there's often a lot of older folks out for their shopping or haircuts. For context, there's a retirement village not far from these shops. I found a different salon elsewhere in the same shopping centre, but I was initially very worried about going in because it was unfamiliar territory. Such is the nature of being neurodivergent, I suppose. But after discussing the matter with a close friend, I ended up biting the bullet and going in anyway. The end result was a very short wait time, less than 5 minutes as it turned out, and a service from a woman who was unexpectedly friendly, and didn't mind me talking about railway stuff, including the City Rail Link in Auckland and those ex-British Rail Mark II coaches that ended up in New Zealand, as well as my taste in music. And yes, I ended up slipping a mention of Tony Basil, and the extended 7 minute and 30-second mix of her song Over My Head into the conversation. Surprisingly, the hairdresser even knew of that one British foamer who's really famous, for some reason, and often wears a fisheye GoPro on a headband. I guess the moral of the story is that things can still turn out fine in the end, even if you're initially very nervous and thinking the outcome could be terrible. In the end, that visit to the new hair salon, which only opened on the 4th of June 2026, was $43 well spent. Now if you'll excuse me, I'm off to potter about in Railroads Online again, while I wait for the long-awaited Century of Steam to finally be released. I really hope COS will be worth the wait, given how long it's been since the game was announced, and it looks like it's going to be the Railroads Online killer, if you will. Anyway, if you stuck around to the end of the video, you win a dimly lit beacon that points out the location of a British comedian called Ronnie. It's the Darker Barker Marker.